The blaring of sirens shattered the peaceful hum of my Sunday morning as two squad cars skidded to a halt in front of my house. I was still holding a bag of organic kale in one hand and a tub of almond yogurt in the other when an officer shouted at me to step away from the porch. At first, I thought someone had broken into a neighbor's home, maybe a robbery or even a medical emergency. But when the officer approached with a furrowed brow and asked if I was in possession of unregistered agricultural products, I blinked in disbelief. Then Karen walked into frame, flanked by two HOA board members and waving her clipboard like a royal decree. She jabbed her finger at my groceries and yelled, "That's the guy I told you about. He brings in those suspicious greens every week. I warned you he's part of some underground food operation." The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying not to laugh, but protocol demanded they investigate. I stood there in my own driveway being interrogated for my produce. My crime kale apparently to Karen Organic meant illegal, and my front porch was now a suspected vegetable cartel hub. Just 4 days earlier I had been living my best life, enjoying the quiet escape of moving out of the city and into what was supposed to be a calm suburban neighborhood. My name's Jay. I'm a certified nutritionist who works remotely, and after years of dodging honking taxis and inhaling smog with every breath, I thought a neighborhood tucked away behind a gate would bring the serenity I crave. My new house came with a modest garden, a front yard big enough for a compost bin, and most importantly walking distance to the Sunday farmers market. The house was perfect. The neighbors seemed decent. But then I met Karen. I first spotted her 2 days after I moved in. She was marching down the sidewalk with military precision, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and dragging what looked like a rolling file cabinet behind her. She introduced herself as the HOA president and handed me a laminated list of neighborhood guidelines with more bold red warnings than a nuclear safety manual. No unauthorized yard decor, no unsanctioned signage, no overnight guests without written notice, and apparently no grocery bags left unattended for more than 5 minutes. I laughed. She did not. Things were tense from the beginning but tolerable. I kept to myself, hosted no wild parties, and made sure my recycling bins were neatly tucked away. But the moment she saw me return from the farmer's market that first Sunday, carrying a mesh bag of leafy greens and a mason jar of locally sourced pickles, something in her snapped. She marched up my driveway as I was unloading and asked, "Do you have permits for those?" I thought she was joking. I told her the only permit I had was a debit card with a decent cashback plan. She scowled and scribbled something in her notebook. Fast forward to today. After the officers cleared me of any wrongdoing and confirmed my kale was, in fact, just kale, Karen stood her ground. She accused me of violating HOA codes about foreign soil contamination. I reminded her that I hadn't planted anything in the yard yet, but that only seemed to inflame her more. She stormed off shouting something about toxic arugula and federal oversight. The officers, clearly amused, advised me to keep my receipts and maybe avoid antagonizing her further. I said I wasn't antagonizing anyone. I just liked good lettuce. One officer chuckled and said, "Around here, that might be your biggest mistake." That afternoon, I got my first HOA violation letter. It was slid under my door in a red envelope like a scene from a dystopian movie. It stated that I had breached Clause 14C by importing suspicious organic material without approval from the Homeowner Oversight Committee. I almost choked on my chia pudding. Clause 14C was apparently a rarely enforced rule written decades ago when someone tried to plant a cannabis hedge on their property. Karen had dug it up, dusted it off, and now used it as her weapon. I called the HOA office, only to be told that the board would be discussing the matter next week and that I was expected to attend the hearing. That night, as I was putting groceries away, I noticed something strange on my doorbell camera. Karen. Dressed in full sweats and moving with the stealth of a cat burglar, she crept up my steps and leaned over my recycling bin. She took out a receipt, held it to her phone flashlight, and snapped several pictures. Then she pulled out a jar of organic honey from the bag I had yet to bring inside and examined it like it was radioactive. She left in a hurry when a motion-activated light flicked on. I replayed the footage 3 times, not because I couldn't believe it, but because I had to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Who in their right mind spies on someone's groceries like this? The next day, I shared the footage with a neighbor named Trina, who had warned me about Karen on move-in day. Trina burst out laughing. "You're officially on her list," she said between giggles. "Once you're on the list, she watches everything. There was the guy who got fined for having too many basil pot, and the woman who was almost evicted over a kombucha brewing station. Karen's not afraid to go full conspiracy theorist if she thinks someone's violating the HOA's purity code." I didn't know what the HOA's purity code was, but I knew this had gone way too far. I was being treated like a criminal over kale. I started locking my grocery bags in the trunk and sneaking them into the house like contraband. I stopped composting temporarily. I even replaced my eco-friendly cloth bags with generic paper ones just to avoid giving her more ammo. But none of it helped. The next week, she called pest control claiming that my tomatoes attracted raccoons. They showed up, found no raccoons, and left with free cucumbers I had grown on my kitchen windowsill. I tried reasoning with her one last time, asked her why this mattered so much. Her answer: "You're different. You bring change. That makes people uncomfortable." It wasn't just about groceries anymore. It was about control. Karen didn't like that I didn't fit into her box of what a neighbor should be. I worked from home, I ate organic, I didn't play HOA politics. And that made me dangerous. So I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped hiding. I started planning. I reread the HOA handbook from front to back. And what I found inside was something that might change everything. An old bylaw. One that Karen had clearly forgotten about. One that gave me power she never expected. The war over groceries was just beginning. And I wasn't about to lose to a woman who thought kombucha was a code word for contraband. The letter summoning me to the upcoming HOA disciplinary hearing came sealed in a thick beige envelope, embossed with gold foil letters that made it look more like an invitation to a gala than a summons over vegetables. It read, in an unervingly formal tone, that I was being called to answer for repeated violations of community policy regarding the unauthorized transport, storage, and display of uncertified organic good. It might have sounded ridiculous to anyone else, but in this neighborhood, under Karen's rule, it was dead serious. I arrived at the hearing room precisely on time, dressed in a clean button-down and jeans, trying to strike the balance between respectful and not cowed. The hearing was held in the HOA Community Center, a sterile building that smelled faintly of disinfectant and overused air fresheners. At the far end of the room sat 3 people behind a long table, their name placards lined up like a tribunal. At the center, of course, sat Karen, her lips pressed into a judgmental line, fingers laced together like she was preparing to sentence me to exile. The room had a small audience. Curious neighbors, a few elderly residents who clearly had nothing better to do, and one guy in gym shorts who seemed like he had just wandered in looking for a free coffee. The proceedings began with Karen reading out the formal charges, her voice trembling with a mix of authority and irritation. She described my actions as a breach of neighborhood trust, accusing me of trafficking unverified produce, displaying illegal yard herbs without approval, and destabilizing the community's image with compost activity. I could barely keep a straight face, but when she brought out a slideshow labeled Exhibit A, I nearly lost it. The first image was a zoomed-in photo of a basil plant on my windowsill, taken from what must have been 30 feet away. The second was my grocery bag, circled in red with a caption that read potential contraband. The third was a screenshot of my social media post with the caption Sunday Harvest and a smug emoji. She claimed this was evidence of intention to distribute. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and calmly explained that I was not breaking any laws, nor HOA guidelines as I understood them. I laid out receipts, including my most recent purchase from the farmer's market, and pointed out the absurdity of treating kale like heroin. I even quoted their own handbook, which made no mention of food restrictions beyond outdoor waste disposal. Karen interrupted twice, each time citing vague clauses that sounded made up. One board member, an older woman named Sylvia, whispered something to the man beside her. He nodded, his face tight, probably trying to suppress his own laughter. But the vote to issue me a formal citation passed 2-1. Karen smirked like she had just captured a fugitive. I left the hearing room with a new sense of purpose. Later that day, I got a text from Trina, the only board member who had voted against the citation. She asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a small cafe just outside the HOA limits, where the air seemed freer and the scones didn't come with HOA approval. She leaned in and whispered like we were plotting an escape from prison. Karen has been trying to push an anti-organic agenda for years. She thinks anything outside her control is a threat. She once tried to ban outdoor thermometers because someone used one that wasn't HOA issued. I asked her what could be done. Trina looked around and said, "You have more support than you think. People are tired of her nonsense, but they're scared. She runs this place like a kingdom. But if you could rally enough residents, maybe show that you're not the problem, maybe you could turn this around." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and started sketching out a plan. If Karen wanted to paint me as a disruptive outsider, I needed to become something she couldn't control, an advocate. Not just for myself, but for the community. I reached out to local friends, a group of health-conscious folks who ran co-ops, taught yoga, and preached the gospel of sprouted lentils. We planned a gathering. Not a protest, not a confrontation, but an educational event, a public organic awareness barbecue. We'd serve plant-based food, give out free produce samples, and teach anyone interested about sustainable gardening and healthy living. No speeches. Just knowledge. If Karen wanted a war, I'd win it with seitan burgers and mint lemonade. The day of the event, I set up in my backyard with help from a few volunteers. We strung up lights, laid out tables, and fired up the grill. Neighbors trickled in slowly at first, curious and cautious. Then more came. Families, elderly couples, even a few people I'd never seen before. We had local chefs giving cooking demos, kids planting herbs in small pots, and a beekeeper explaining the role of pollinators. People were smiling, talking, connecting. It was everything the neighborhood had been missing. And then, of course, Karen showed up. She marched through the gate like she was raiding a speakeasy. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on a grill full of marinated tofu and jackfruit sliders. She pulled out her phone and started filming, declaring in a loud voice, "This is an unauthorized public gathering involving suspicious food items. You are in violation of HOA policy." Someone handed her a smoothie. She knocked it away like it was poison. Then she pulled out her trump card. "I've called the fire department," she said proudly. "I've reported an open flame without a sanctioned burn permit." Minutes later, 2 firefighters arrived. The mood turned tense. They approached me first and asked what was going on. I explained everything. No actual fire, just grilling, no alcohol, all clean and respectful. One firefighter took a look around, spotted a table with honey tasting, and said, "You know what this looks like to me, a potluck." They ended up staying. They ate. They smiled. Karen, watching from the street, realized she had lost control of the moment. But she wasn't done. 2 days later, I received notice that Karen had filed a nuisance suit against me in small claims court. She was accusing me of damaging her reputation, lowering her property value, and causing community unrest through my dietary practices. The lawsuit was 3 pages long and included words like kale cult and leafy extremist. I read it twice and laughed so hard I dropped a cucumber on my cat. But then it hit me. She was trying to bury me in paperwork and procedures, hoping I'd give up and move away. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. I went straight to the county records office, pulled every document I could find on the HOA charter, the bylaws, the zoning permissions. I stayed up until 2 a.m. for 2 nights straight, highlighting every obscure clause that could work in my favor. And then I found it. A forgotten passage buried in a document dated 20 years ago. It granted HOA members the right to host community events centered around enrichment and education without board approval, provided they served a clear benefit. My organic awareness barbecue fit that definition perfectly. Karen had tried to weaponize the rules, but I had found the rule that could end her reign. I sat back and stared at the dusty paper in my hand. For the first time since kale became contraband, I wasn't just reacting. I was ready to fight back. The grocery war had turned legal, and I had just found my secret weapon. All I needed now was the right moment to strike. And it was coming fast. It started with a single email to a few like-minded neighbors and ended up with a list of over 40 people confirming attendance to what I dubbed the Neighborhood Sustainability Series. Using the loophole I had discovered in the HOA bylaws, I branded the events as educational community outreach programs focused on sustainable living, local agriculture, and home-based wellness. Each event was perfectly legal, completely open to the public, and infuriatingly untouchable by Karen. The first gathering was small but promising. We hosted a composting 101 session in my backyard. A local environmental science teacher explained how kitchen scraps could be turned into rich garden soil. We had free samples of organic seeds and handouts about reducing food waste. Kids laughed while learning how to layer greens and browns in a compost bin. It was wholesome, peaceful, and most importantly, Karen-proof. At least, that's what I thought. Karen didn't attend. Instead, she sent a woman named Martha, an older resident known for her binoculars and sour lemonade. Martha walked through the event smiling too widely, commenting on how everything looked lovely, and snapping photos of everything with a disposable camera. Yes, a disposable camera. Later that evening, my friend Greg called me to say Martha had bragged about being Karen's eyes and ears, and was compiling a report titled Potential Environmental Hazards Posed by Radical Gardeners. I wasn't even mad. I was almost impressed. Karen had an actual surveillance network. The next week, things escalated. I woke up to find a note taped to my compost bin warning me that biohazard materials had been detected and that a formal investigation would be launched. A second note, this one stuffed in my mailbox without postage, claimed that composting raw vegetables could attract aggressive wildlife and create methane buildup. I found both notes ridiculous until I walked out to the bin and caught a whiff of something that absolutely did not belong. Flies buzzed angrily as I lifted the lid and recoiled from the stench. Someone had dumped a bag of spoiled meat into my perfectly layered compost. Not just a little meat, pounds of it, wrapped in plastic and beginning to rot. I was furious. I had gone out of my way to follow every rule, use correct bins, and stay within the limits of my rights. And now someone was sabotaging me. I pulled the footage from my motion-activated backyard camera. There, just before sunrise, was Karen. Dressed in all black, moving awkwardly like she had seen too many spy movies, she crept across my lawn holding a garbage bag. She popped open the compost lid, dumped the contents, and scurried off into the dawn like she had just planted evidence on a rival spy. I couldn't believe it. It was one thing to complain or file frivolous reports, but this was criminal. I saved the footage, downloaded it onto a flash drive, and decided it was time to loop in law enforcement. I drove down to the local sheriff's office, asked to speak to someone about a nuisance complaint, and handed over the video. The deputy watched it twice, squinting at the screen before letting out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "that's not just an HOA problem. That's illegal dumping and trespassing." He told me they'd issue her a formal warning and forward the complaint to the city code enforcement office. I returned home that afternoon feeling strangely victorious, but the moment I pulled into my driveway, I found a new surprise waiting. A county vehicle was parked nearby, and a man in khakis and a green polo stood by my gate holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a county environmental inspector, said he was responding to an anonymous complaint about unsafe agricultural practices on private property. Of course it was Karen. I invited him in, showed him the garden, the compost setup, the grocery storage, and even my shelf of kombucha brewing jars. He took notes, asked polite questions, and by the end of the visit, he was shaking his head and chuckling. "Honestly, this is one of the cleanest setups I've seen," he said. "Whoever reported you probably doesn't know the difference between manure and mulch." I laughed and said, "That's the problem. They think anything natural must be dangerous." He told me I had nothing to worry about and offered to send a formal certification letter for my property. I accepted immediately. If Karen wanted paperwork, I'd give her plenty of it. With the certification letter in hand and the sheriff's warning issued, word began to spread around the neighborhood. I wasn't just the weirdo with the kale anymore. I was the guy standing up to Karen and winning. People who had previously kept their heads down started talking. One neighbor, a retired librarian named Mr. Daly, stopped by to say he admired my calm in the face of chaos. Another neighbor brought over a lemon pie and whispered that Karen had once fined her for hanging wind chimes. I started getting emails from other HOA members asking for advice on building raised garden beds, composting basics, and even how to start a mini greenhouse. That's when I knew it was time for the next step. I wasn't going to win this battle by staying on the defensive. I needed to change the power dynamic. I looked up the HOA election calendar and saw that 3 board seats were opening up in 3 months. If I could run, campaign, and win just 1 seat, I'd have a say in what went on. If I could inspire others to do the same, we could shift the balance of the board away from Karen's grip. I announced my candidacy with a simple flyer pinned to the community board. It read, "Let's grow something better. Vote J for HOA board." I expected backlash, but the overwhelming response was support. People stopped me on walks, honked in encouragement, even brought over hand-painted signs for their lawns. Karen didn't respond at first. She watched, waited, calculating. But a week before the next community event, she made her move. She sent out a full-color flyer to every mailbox titled "The Truth About Jay," featuring a blurry photo of me at the barbecue, holding a zucchini like it was contraband. The flyer accused me of forming a cult-like group focused on food extremism, threatening neighborhood values, and using underhanded tactics to brainwash residents. She even included an out-of-context quote from my blog about the dangers of processed food, twisting it to sound like I wanted to ban canned soup. I laughed when I read it, but others were furious. Trina brought her copy over and said, "This is it. She's gone too far." The flyer backfired spectacularly. Residents began showing up to events in droves. We held seed swaps, gardening tutorials, and workshops on making non-toxic cleaning products. Every event doubled as a quiet campaign rally. My reputation as the neighborhood's compost crusader had transformed into something more powerful. I was becoming a symbol of peaceful resistance to Karen's outdated, obsessive control. On the night of our biggest event yet, as people milled about under hanging lanterns and acoustic guitar played in the background, I stood beside my garden and realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about giving the neighborhood its voice back. The closer we got to the HOA board election, the more desperate Karen became. She had controlled the board and the neighborhood for so long that the idea of someone like me, someone she couldn't intimidate or outmaneuver, sitting beside her was unbearable. Her attacks became more frequent and more unhinged. She distributed another round of flyers, this time warning residents about the dangers of unregulated herbal growth, claiming my backyard had become a magnet for pests, fungi, and radical ideas. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss banning unsanctioned education events, a transparent jab at my community workshop. But the moment she tried to introduce the motion, 2 board members objected. Sylvia, the older woman who once whispered in the hearing, stood up and said, "Karen, you're embarrassing yourself." That sentence rang out like a shot across the bow. The room fell silent. Karen's face turned a shade of red that could only be described as beetroot with rage. Behind the scenes, I kept my momentum going. I launched a neighborhood newsletter packed with tips on sustainable living, calendar invites for upcoming events, and highlights of families who had started their own gardens. I didn't mention Karen by name, but her influence was clear in the contrast. Where she ruled through fear and fines, I built through laughter and lettuce. One of the most popular features in the newsletter was a Garden of the Week spotlight. People started submitting photos of their backyards, window boxes, and balconies blooming with edible plants. It wasn't long before even longtime rule followers started rebelling in small, leafy ways. Someone grew strawberries in their mailbox planter. Another neighbor replaced their front lawn with clover. Even Mr. Daly, who once said he had a brown thumb, managed to raise a decent tomato vine along his fence. Karen could only watch from her manicured grass lot as the neighborhood turned green without her permission. Then came the final community event before the election. We called it the Harvest Potluck and held it in the cul-de-sac, right where Karen's house stood like a disapproving judge. Everyone brought a dish made with something from their garden or a local farm. Tables were lined with colorful salads, fresh baked bread, herbal teas, and one suspiciously delicious beet hummus. I gave a short talk about reclaiming our sense of community and how every seed planted was a stand against unnecessary control. Just as I finished, a car pulled up and out stepped a news crew. Turns out, a local journalist had caught wind of the drama from our social media posts and decided it was the kind of bizarre suburban story that made for great television. The cameras rolled, people smiled, and I answered a few questions about the neighborhood's transformation. Karen, who had been glaring at us from behind her curtains, burst out of her front door mid-interview shouting, "This isn't sanctioned, this isn't a permitted gathering, you're all in violation." The camera caught everything: her flailing arms, the rants about unauthorized basil, the way she tried to block the cameraman with a patio umbrella. When they turned to me, I simply said, "We're just neighbors sharing food and stories. Nothing dangerous about that." The next morning, the story aired. The headline was Suburban Garden War Pits Organic Advocate Against HOA Overlord. I thought the framing was a little dramatic, but the footage spoke for itself. Within hours, the clip went viral locally. My inbox was flooded with supportive emails. A nearby town even invited me to speak at their community garden opening. But most importantly, undecided neighbors who had stayed silent during the chaos finally chose a side. Karen, however, had one last plan. On the morning of the HOA vote, she and her few remaining loyalists set up a community values checkpoint near the polling location. They wore matching polo shirts and clipboards, asking residents questions like, "Do you believe in traditional landscaping, and have you ever purchased kombucha with a debit card or cash?" It was laughable, but it made people uneasy. One woman told me she felt like she was being interrogated at a customs desk just for carrying a reusable shopping bag. I filed a complaint with the HOA election committee, but by then the damage had already turned into comedy. Someone took a photo of Karen's group and made a meme that said, "Beware the Kale Patrol." It spread through neighborhood group chats like wildfire. When it came time to vote, people showed up in record numbers. The ballot box was monitored, the process transparent, and the count was held publicly in the community hall. As the votes were tallied, it became clear that Karen was losing grip. Her preferred candidates were far behind. The race for my seat came down to a dead tie between me and a longtime board member named Clark, who had remained neutral throughout the chaos. Only one vote remained to be counted. It belonged to Hank, a grizzled newcomer with a military haircut and a stare that could cut glass. No one knew where he stood. He stepped up, cast his vote, and whispered something to the election official. The vote was read aloud. "Jay wins." The room erupted in claps and cheers. Trina hugged me. Mr. Daly shook my hand and said, "Let's get some real work done." Karen stood still, her jaw slack, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply turned and walked out of the hall like a dethroned queen. At the first board meeting under the new leadership, Karen was still technically a member. She arrived 15 minutes late, slammed her binder on the table, and tried to take over the agenda. But the new chair, a soft-spoken woman named Gloria who had once been fined by Karen for having wind chimes that were too melodic, politely cut her off. "Thank you, Karen. We'll stick to the agreed schedule." The meeting proceeded smoothly. We passed a motion to review outdated bylaws, approved a plan to expand the community garden, and drafted a new guideline encouraging shared green spaces. Karen sat there the entire time fuming. At the end, she made one last dramatic gesture. She stood up, looked at me, and said, "This neighborhood has lost its values. I hope you're all ready for the chaos you've invited." Then she stormed out, knocking over a tray of cucumber water on her way. I stayed behind, helped clean up, and watched as neighbors lingered to talk, laugh, and plan new things. The tension that had gripped the community for years began to unravel. Without Karen's constant scrutiny, people began reconnecting. Kids played in yards. Elderly residents exchanged plants. Someone even started a produce-sharing board where neighbors could trade excess herbs or vegetables. It felt like healing. That week, Karen's resignation letter was sent via email. It was short, bitter, and full of accusations, but it ended with the line, "I refuse to serve on a board that allows lettuce to dictate policy." I printed it out and pinned it to my fridge, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what we'd overcome. I didn't celebrate the end of her era because I wanted revenge. I celebrated it because we'd won back something we hadn't realized we'd lost, a sense of shared ownership, of community. Karen's departure from the HOA board didn't mean she vanished entirely. For a few weeks after her resignation, there were reports of her walking around the perimeter of the neighborhood like she was still patrolling it. She didn't speak to anyone, and nobody spoke to her. It was as if the entire suburb had silently agreed to give her a wide berth. But as the weeks passed, her presence diminished until she was just another story told at block parties. Some said she had moved to a stricter neighborhood nearby. Others claimed she was campaigning to run the HOA board in a retirement community. All I knew was that her house, once the center of power and paranoia, now sat behind drawn curtains with a for sale sign planted in the front yard. It didn't stay on the market long. A young couple with 2 kids and a rescue dog moved in. They replaced the manicured shrubs with butterfly bushes and strung up solar light. Within days, their kids were playing with others on the sidewalk, and the once ominous lot had turned into a corner of laughter and life. With Karen gone, we focused on rebuilding, not just the board, but the fabric of the neighborhood itself. One of our first official actions was to establish a community garden in a vacant lot the HOA had previously refused to use, citing obscure concerns about visual cohesion. Volunteers brought tools, neighbors donated seeds, and within a month, neat rows of spinach, radishes, and tomatoes began to sprout. Every Saturday morning, families would gather to tend their plots, share stories, and enjoy the fresh air. There was no shouting, no rulebooks, no one measuring the height of planters. Just people growing together. One morning, a resident named Denise walked up to me with tears in her eyes. She held out a bunch of basil and said, "This is the first thing I've ever grown. I never thought I could do this." That moment meant more than any vote or headline ever could. The changes weren't just in the garden. The entire mood of the neighborhood shifted. People who had lived side by side for years but never spoken now waved and chatted over fences. Lawn signs that once said things like HOA proud were replaced with ones that read "Be friendly" or "Love your neighbor." The HOA newsletter, which Karen once used to scold residents for minor infractions, became a celebration of community efforts, spotlighting achievements and sharing tips. We even added a comic strip drawn by a teenager who used to be terrified of Karen's fines for skateboarding. His first strip was about a grumpy HOA overlord who loses her power to a tomato plant with a law degree. Of course, there were still challenges. Not everyone was thrilled by the new direction. A small group of traditionalists grumbled about the loss of order and voiced concerns about the neighborhood's image. They tried to push back during one board meeting, arguing that the community garden attracted bugs and that the sound of kids laughing was disruptive to the peace. But this time, instead of facing them alone, I watched as half a dozen residents stood up and shared how the garden had improved their mental health, brought their families closer, or even helped them save money on groceries. The complaints faded. The board voted unanimously to protect the garden and expand community activities. It wasn't long before our story began attracting attention beyond our little street. A local magazine featured a piece titled "The Neighborhood That Grew Back," highlighting our transformation. A nonprofit reached out, asking if we'd mentor other HOA communities trying to shake off oppressive leadership. We agreed and soon found ourselves hosting monthly Zoom calls with residents from across the country. People told us horror stories about being fined for sidewalk chalk, harassed for having non-uniform bird feeders, or reprimanded for putting up little free libraries. We listened, we shared what worked, and we encouraged them to organize, connect, and stand up for kindness over control. The impact rippled out, and while we couldn't fix every HOA horror, we gave people hope, and sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can give. One day, as I walked to the garden with a basket full of green beans, I noticed a familiar face standing at the edge of the lot. It was Karen. She looked older, more tired, as if the weight of years of policing tulips had finally caught up to her. She didn't step inside. She just watched quietly for a few minutes, her eyes scanning the rows of vegetables and sunflowers. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave her a small nod. She didn't return it. A moment later, she turned and walked away, disappearing down the sidewalk. That was the last time I saw her. Life moved on. We started a tool-lending library in a shed behind the community center. A group of retirees began hosting a monthly bake sale, donating proceeds to local food bank. The kids formed a nature club and built birdhouses to hang around the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. It was alive. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like home. The end of the year brought the Harvest Festival. It wasn't a fancy affair, just long tables filled with food grown and cooked by neighbors. There were roasted root vegetables, herb breads, fresh apple cider, and more than one dish made from zucchini, which had grown in abundance. People laughed, hugged, swapped recipes. I stood back for a moment, watching the scene, the lights strung between trees, the kids running with dirt on their cheeks, the couples dancing barefoot on the grass, and felt something settle inside me. Peace maybe. Or pride. Trina came up beside me, holding a plate of carrot cake. "You did good," she said. I shook my head. "We did." She smiled and said, "Remember when this street was afraid of compost?" I laughed. "Yeah. Now they're arguing over who makes the best organic fertilizer." We stood there in companionable silence, watching the neighborhood we had fought so hard to protect thrive without fear. As the sun dipped below the rooftops and the festival rolled on, someone brought out a projector and played a slideshow of the year's best photos. Smiling faces, gardens in bloom, even a still from the news broadcast with Karen Midrand. Everyone laughed. I couldn't help but think of how close we came to losing this. How one person's obsession with control nearly strangled the roots of something beautiful. But in the end, it didn't work. Because kindness took hold. Laughter spread. And the seeds we planted grew into something stronger than rules or restrictions. They grew into community. As I packed up for the night, a little girl ran up to me and handed me a drawing. It was a picture of our garden, colorful and wild, with people smiling beneath a sun made of yellow hearts. She'd written one sentence across the top in crooked block letters. "Thank you for the food and the fun." I looked at her, smiled, and said, "You're welcome." But the truth was, I should have thanked her. Because she was the reason it was all worth it. So no, this wasn't the story of a war won with shouts or legal tricks. It was the story of a neighborhood that reclaimed its soul. It was the story of how groceries turned into a revolution. And in a way, it was the story of Karen too. Because without her obsession, we might never have realized how much power we had when we stood together. She tried to tear us apart with fear. But we chose to plant something instead. And now, every time I bite into a sun-warmed tomato from the garden we built, I remember exactly what that means.